Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. So today, we're stepping into a deeply relatable space. A space that I think, well, pretty much every single one of us has sat in at some point in our lives. We're talking about setting boundaries, protecting our peace, and finally letting go of that desperate need to defend our hearts to people who just aren't listening.
Now think about this for a second. Why do we constantly try to explain our intentions to a closed door? Picture this. It's late at night. You're completely exhausted, right? But instead of sleeping, there you are, staring at a blank text draft on your glowing phone screen. You are desperately trying to find the exact perfect combination of words that will finally make someone understand your heart. You delete, you retype, you agonize over punctuation. Why on earth do we do this?
Okay, let's dive right into this first section, the exhausting spinning wheel, or as I like to call it, the late-night text draft.
The late-night text draft actually represents something incredibly profound about human nature, a state of just total emotional exhaustion. It's what the source material perfectly describes as the spinning wheel feeling. You tell yourself, okay, if I can just explain it one more time, maybe if I just use a different analogy or a softer tone, they'll finally see I literally didn't mean to hurt them. We continuously rewrite, hoping just one more explanation is going to unlock their empathy. But, spoiler alert, it rarely ever does.
Which brings us to section 2, clarifying versus defending, or building bridges versus handing over ammunition.
To really grasp why this over-explaining doesn't work, we've got to separate healthy communication from a totally toxic loop. See, when you clarify yourself to someone who genuinely wants to understand you, that simple act brings connection. It acts as a bridge. But when you're repeatedly defending yourself to someone who has already made up their mind about you, the dynamic shifts entirely. Your explanations are no longer bridges. They literally just become ammunition for them to use against you. So, why do we do it? Let's look at section 3, the cost of survival and the resulting emotional bankruptcy.
Seriously, if we know the other person isn't listening, why do we keep engaging in this unwinnable game? Well, at our core, we are hardwired for connection. We just want to be seen as safe and good and loving. So when someone paints us as the villain, it triggers this visceral, deep-seated sense of panic. Defending ourselves kicks in as a literal survival mechanism. We freak out, thinking that if we just stop explaining, we're basically silently agreeing with their totally false narrative.
But here's the really tragic cost of that survival mechanism. As this quote brilliantly points out, you spend all your creative energy, your peace, and your sleep trying to prove your innocence to a courtroom that has already decided you're guilty. It's a game you absolutely cannot win. And why? Because they aren't listening to understand you. They're only listening to find a tiny little crack in your explanation so they can use it against you.
To show you exactly how this exhausting loop plays out in real life, let's look at the story of Sarah, who spent years trying to navigate a highly critical business partner. It would go like this. First, Sarah would propose a totally normal boundary. Then her partner would twist it, accusing Sarah of being hostile. Obviously triggered by being cast as the bad guy, Sarah would write these incredibly thoughtful, long emails detailing her pure intentions, trying to soften the blow. And finally, her partner would weaponize exactly one out-of-context sentence from that massive email to fuel yet another accusation. She was chasing a ghost. I want to pause here for just a second to really let that sink in. Sarah was completely exhausting herself for an illusion. She eventually had this quiet, super painful epiphany. Her partner's view of her had absolutely nothing to do with Sarah's actual behavior. In reality, her partner actively needed Sarah to be the difficult one so they could avoid facing their own internal issues. This leads right into section 4, misunderstanding versus deliberate misrepresentation, which we can look at through the analogy of a dropped glass.
So this brings us to a pivotal concept that shifted everything for Sarah, grasping the real difference between a simple misunderstanding and a deliberate misrepresentation. Take an accidentally dropped glass. You apologize, the air clears, connection is restored, right? That's a misunderstanding. But a misrepresentation, that's when you apologize, you buy a brand new glass, and they still spend the next month telling everyone you are this reckless, destructive person. No amount of explaining fixes that because the false narrative is actively serving them.
Okay. Moving on to section 5, the quiet boundary, and how Sarah finally stopped the emails. Once Sarah recognized she was actually dealing with deliberate misrepresentation, she totally changed her strategy. She stopped writing the emails. When the next accusation rolled in, she deployed what the source calls the quiet boundary. She simply replied, "I hear your perspective, but that isn't where I'm coming from. I think it's best we keep our conversations strictly to the logistics of the project." Notice what she did there. She didn't become better. She didn't lash out.
She just stopped offering her heart to a space that simply wasn't safe. Now, I do want to make sure we're being really careful here. This explainer is absolutely not advocating for some sort of cold, prideful arrogance. True maturity means we still have to remain open to healthy accountability. There's a sort of litmus test for mutual healing. If there is a willingness to listen, a real capacity for self-reflection, acceptance of legitimate correction, and the humility to actually apologize, then yeah, you engage. If someone genuinely loves you, they will help you find a way to understand each other.
But remember this quote: if they are invested in keeping you in a box, silence is often the wisest, most respectful boundary you can offer. Maturity teaches us that not every single accusation requires a response from you. When you finally realize you don't actually need to win every argument to protect your innocence, you take your power back. You stop letting someone else's distorted opinion dictate whether or not you get a good night's sleep. Which brings us to our final section: let your character speak and anchoring yourself in truth. If we're going to stop endlessly explaining ourselves to closed doors, we have to anchor in truth internally. I love thinking about it this way. Your character is a slow-burning light. It doesn't need a megaphone. Over time, the truth always outlives a lie. Always. You don't have to exhaust yourself loudly defending your integrity when your daily life and your consistent actions are already quietly proving it. If you're constantly chasing the approval of people who have already made up their minds, you are literally just handing them the keys to your peace.
So, if you're listening to this right now, and maybe you're drafting that text message in your head, just take a deep breath, let your hands open. You can walk away right now without carrying all that resentment in your chest. Explain yourself when understanding is possible, for sure, but you do not have to spend your life trying to change the mind of someone who has already decided exactly who you are.
I want to leave you with this final, kind of profound question from the source material. Do you realize you do not have to convince everyone of your innocence to be worthy of rest? You know your own heart. Walk softly in your truth and let your character speak for itself, because your peace, it's simply too valuable to sacrifice to someone who has chosen to misunderstand you. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Protect your peace, and as always, keep learning.